Hello everyone, it's Darcy. I just want to do a recording because I neglected to record the webinar about passing information back and forth from Storyline to the LMS. So I'm just going to do a quick screencast with the same stuff that I talked about during the webinar. I'm going to use this document throughout the video as kind of the agenda for the screencast. The first thing we should talk about is why would you do this kind of activity? Because we have to make sure that what we do, our practices are research based or supported by research. And what I did was pull kind of three sources. The first is a book that we all have, or we should have in our libraries, is Engaging the Online Learner. It's a pretty short book. And if you look in chapter 3 on page 31, it talks specifically about reflective self-assessments for learners. And that's what we're going to use, the thing we're building for in our course today. And it talks about using reflection and self-assessment in online courses and some of the research behind that. So check that out. The second research you should check out is a fantastic book. It's one of my favorite books, E-Learning and the Science of Instruction. And if you look at chapter 14, it's around page 333, it talks about teaching thinking skills in an online course and making thinking processes explicit for learners. And it talks about, of course, promoting learner reflection, which is what we're doing here today, and some of the research behind that. And then the third thing is an article about inquiry-based learning. And it's a bit of a fluffier article. And it's talking about inquiry-based learning and how that kind of reintroduces curiosity into the online classroom, which is a feature that not a lot of online classes do well. So check out that article and those chapters from the books because they're really good research. So before we go any further, let's just, I want to demonstrate the working version of what we built, what Ed and I built. And that's located in the Standard Course Showcase. That's a course within my courses. So you can follow the link in the agenda, or you can navigate to the Standard Course Showcase course that's within my courses, and then look under the Interactive Lessons module, and look at the submodule called Passing Data Back and Forth from Interactive to My Courses. And there'll be two topics within that submodule. The first is the Storyline file or project that you'll see in a second here, grabs some input from the learner and also uses some input from my courses in the Storyline file itself. And then the second one is the follow-up to that activity, which is a self-assessment for learners that reuses some of the information from the Storyline file. So these things are both, using inputs and outputs between Storyline files and my courses. So let's go into that first activity. This is something a student would do at the beginning of a module. So it's just kind of an introduction activity. And there is some audio with it. So beware if you play around with it, if your sound's turned up. So on the second slide, you'll notice here that it's grabbing the student's name, the learner's name, from my courses. You can see it's Philip J, and that's his middle initial. So it split off the last name and just used the first name and middle initial. And that's been inserted into the Storyline file dynamically with a little bit of JavaScript and using a reference in the Storyline file. And again, we'll look at the technical details a little bit later, but I wanted to show you how it works here. On the third slide, again, it uses the student's name within the text, which is really easy to do, and kind of personalizes it for learners. The audio that you hear doesn't use the personalized version, which isn't really that important as far as the activity's goals go. And then there's an input field because it asks the student, how would you describe the difference between sociology and psychology? So it's kind of an informal question. It's kind of a pre-learning question to check their knowledge level or to get them thinking about the essential questions in this module. So they would write an answer there. We're going to say that the difference is that sociology studies groups of people instead of individuals. Okay, and then they proceed to the next slide, And again, they get a personalization in the text, and they get a little open-ended question, what do you think a sociologist studies? Let's say they study groups of people. Okay? And what's happening is, and you'll look a little bit closer at this later, is every time they click outside of this text box or they click that button there, basically whenever the box loses focus, it's saving the information that they've input into that text box. And the last slide just encourages them to get started with a little bit of more personalization, and that's pretty much it for the intro activity. So they would then move on to the rest of the module, which includes other kinds of activities, discussions, readings, the usual stuff that's in an online course. And then at the end of the module, they've already done their quiz, they've already done all of the activities. There's a self-assessment at the end, and this uses the My Courses self-assessment tool, which is very similar to the quiz tool, except that obviously there's no grading associated with it. So it's going to look a lot like a quiz without the little intro and all the security features and so forth. So it's a self-assessment. They get a little bit of information at the top, which tells them, in this exercise, here's what you're going to do. You're going to reflect on what you've learned. And then there are two questions. Question one is, it just basically says at the beginning of the module, Rosalie asks you, Rosalie is the character, she asked you that about the difference between sociology and psychology. And you told her, and then it inputs the text dynamically that was stored from whatever the student typed in that box in the first activity. And it just uses a little fancy CSS trick to make it look like handwriting, basically. So that's what the student told Rosalie, and then it asked, okay, well, that's what you told her at the beginning. How has your learning changed throughout the module? Has your definition of the difference between sociology and psychology changed? And they would type it in here. Their answers in this self-assessment don't really go anywhere. It's just to get them thinking, and the instructor can kind of monitor it to see how their thinking is changing. And then the question 2 is very similar to the first question. You told Rosalie this about what a sociologist studies, and then of course they can reflect upon how their learning has changed. Okay, so it's the same trick again. And then there's just a little blurb at the bottom that says, okay, think about how your learning's changed, and then it also says, most importantly, what strategies did you use to learn the new information? And to keep those in mind as they move to the next module. Okay, so you can play around with those yourself in the standard course showcase within the interactive lessons module, and there's a sub-module containing both of those activities with a little bit of explanation. Okay, so let's go back to our agenda here. We've looked at the working version. Now let's take a peek at what tools are available or what tools are required for you to do for you to build this kind of activity or activities. The first thing we have available is Storyline. Okay, it's available for all of our designers. So you don't need any add-ons or anything fancy like that. You do need to publish in a SCORM compliant format in order for it to work well with the LMS. We already have Desire2Learn, which uses SCORM compliant formats, talks back and forth with them. It uses existing browser features. In this case, it's using what's called LocalStorage to store some information from the Storyline file. And if you don't, there's a link there to the W3 Schools site about LocalStorage. And basically, if you don't know much about it, it's where web apps can store data locally. And it's a little bit better than using cookies because it can store more information. It's got a much higher storage limit than cookies. It's also per origin, which means that any page on the domain can access that data, meaning that anything stored in mycourses.spcollege.edu would be able to access data back and forth. Which is kind of a nice feature. The other thing is that LocalStorage is supported by all of the major browsers. There are other types of storage for data, including SQLite and IndexedDB. So those are the other ways of storing data from your web applications, but they're not all supported by all the major browsers. Local storage is. You can pretty much guarantee that it's going to work across all sorts of platforms for your learners. Okay, so check out that information about local storage. The other thing that's important, just as kind of a reference, is the SCORM data model, number 4 there. And SCORM is basically like a model for data, for passing data back and forth between learning objects, just to kind of establish a standard. And what I've done is link to a visual representation of that data model. And if you look here, we're looking at this core set of models in the SCORM model. And it includes things like the children, the student ID, and the thing that we're going to use, the student name. Okay, so that's part of the core piece in the data model for the runtime environment that we're going to use. Okay, but there's other types of things that you can use as far as SCORM goes. We're only going to access that student name portion. We're also going to use Storyline's LMS API file that it includes along with any Storyline project that's published in SCORM compliant format. And if you click the link, it goes down the document to a list of other functions that you can use within this LMS API file. And there's a lot of them. You can get all kinds of things in and out of the LMS and pass them along to Storyline files. Most importantly, the one we're going to use is highlighted there in yellow, the get student name function. Okay, but know that there are other functions that you can use to build other sorts of objects and activities. And then number 6, the last thing we're going to use is just a little bit of JavaScript. And I am by no means, by the way, an expert on any of these things, any of these 1 through 6 things. I'm an amateur, and I found some JavaScript, repurposed it for this project, and I'm kind of learning as I'm going. So hopefully, you know, that's encouraging for you if you're not feeling like an expert on any of these things. I am by no means an expert, but it works, which is pretty exciting. And I'm hoping that I can build on my knowledge and create some fancier projects going forward. Okay, so those are the requirements. They're things we already have or that all browsers already have. So we don't have to purchase or add anything in order to build this kind of thing. I did want to talk briefly about, you know, how you could storyboard or plan this sort of project. And I did a text-based storyboard and gave that to Ed, who picked up the job, and he created that beautiful dark-styled storyline project that you saw in the working version. And I love that. Thanks to Ed for that, because it was I think it's beautiful the way it's designed. I hadn't really even indicated that, you know, colors or anything, and he just came up with that, so it's gorgeous. And it's basically just 5 or 6 slides as far as the storyboard goes. Inputs and outputs are important, though, along with variables, trying to plan out your variables. In the example I'm going to show you, I didn't plan very far ahead for my variables, and I think, you know, I'll point that out when we get there. But it's important that you have very carefully chosen variable names. And so what I provided here is kind of a table, example of a table that you could use for planning out this sort of project and planning out your variables, your inputs and outputs. So I've included in the first column like a narrative about what this variable would do. And the example here is that first text box that they see where they can type an answer to that open-ended question. And I've named the variable SIG 2000, which is the name of the course, followed by a module number, mod 1, followed by kind of a name for the activity, which is an intro, and then followed by the specific variable name. And that includes the text entry part there is like what type of data this variable would hold. So it's text and then a number, the number 1. And And later you'll see I didn't plan out the variables correctly. So you're not going to see this name again, but I have it here as a better planned example. And you want to be pretty specific like this because you don't want your variables to conflict with other people's variables and other projects. So this is super specific so that hopefully it won't conflict with any other projects or any other variables within this project. And I try and keep my variable names the same, whether it's in Storyline or in the next column, the JavaScript variable, or in the third column there, the LocalStorage variable. I try to make all those names consistent. And then the last column there, you also want to think about what type of output you're going to throw this variable out into. And in this case, I'm going to throw it back out into a self-assessment question at the end of the module. So that helps me and would probably help you plan out variables in your project. It's kind of important when you're programming something like this. Okay, so let's look at how we would configure the Storyline file. All right, so we're switching over to Storyline here in Windows, and we're looking at the story view right now, which is just 5 slides. And again, Ed Gonzalez created this file, so you could see Ed, and he could provide you with a link to the file or maybe a copy of it, so you could take a look at what's going on behind the scenes. We're going to use a couple special features of Storyline, and that includes triggers. And then we're going to use a little bit of JavaScript in conjunction with those triggers. And we're also going to use the Storyline references, which is basically Storyline's name for variables. Okay, they call them references within Storyline. So let's open up this first slide. And so now we're looking in the frame view. And on the right-hand side is where we're going to kind of focus our attention over here in the triggers pane. So we're looking at the triggers pane. And you can see one of the first slide triggers on this intro slide, which is just basically audio narration with a picture and a button. We have to execute a little JavaScript at the very beginning. And I executed at the very beginning because this is the JavaScript that will grab the student's name out of the LMS or out of my courses. So I'm going to go ahead and put that into a variable at the beginning of my Storyline project so then that I know it's already loaded and I can just reuse it throughout the entire Storyline file. So let's take a look at this trigger that we've set up. We created a new trigger. We set the action to be execute JavaScript, okay? And then it gives you this little button to input your script for the JavaScript. We have it set to trigger whenever the timeline starts. So nobody needs to click anything. It just happens automatically as the timeline starts. And obviously it's just applying here to the first frame in the project. So let's take a closer look at the script that's going to execute. Whenever you tell it to execute JavaScript, you're basically going to get a blank text box that looks like this. And I found this script online at the links that you'll see back in the agenda document. You'll see some links here to some of the discussion forums and user communities that I've consulted to find that script. And what I did is just modify it a little bit to make it my own. And we're going to take a closer look at this JavaScript within that agenda document. Because what I've done is kind of highlight some things or provide comments on things, I should say. So if you scroll down in that document to the first set of red text, you'll know it's the right text because it'll say begin script for intro slide trigger. Okay, so the text that you see in the document for intro slide trigger is the same thing that's on that first slide. Okay, and I just marked it up a little bit for you. So the first line here assumes that, it's just a comment that says that it assumes that the LMS API.javascript file is already loaded by Storyline, which happens automatically. If you've published it as an LMS compliant or SCORM compliant file, it'll load that. That's packaged with the project. The first line here, and the lines in black are the actual code lines. The lines in red are my comments. That first line is needed to get that player for reference. Gets the Storyline player for referencing things. The second line here, what it does is assign a variable that's equal to the value of the LMS student name. Okay, so let's look a little bit more closely at this. So the first part means assign a variable, create a variable. The second word here names that variable. So I'm creating a variable that's called my name. Okay, and you can assign it whatever name you'd like. And then there's space equals space, so that means I'm creating a variable, and I'm going to set that variable equal to whatever follows the equal sign. And then there's a function. So the little function here calls the LMS API file and says, okay, use a part of that LMS API file, and I want you to use the function within that file that gets the student name out of the LMS. Okay, so basically it's saying, use the getStudentName function of the LMS API file that's included with your Storyline project and set that equal to a new variable that's called my_name. Okay, so that's basically what that one line of code does. The next line creates an array, which is a list of things, kind of, by splitting the student name. And whenever that name is grabbed out of the LMS, it's last name, comma, first name. And so you kind of have to split it up, or else it'll look wonky within your project. It won't look quite as magical. So again, we're defining a variable here. That's what that var is. And we're saying the variable is an array, and we're setting that equal to that first variable that we defined, my name. Remember, up in the second line of code, we're defining that variable called my name. And we're going to say, let's split that variable, and then in parentheses, we're going to split it with the comma. So we're using the comma as the splitting thing. So again, we're looking at the student name that we got from that variable my name. We're splitting it at the comma, and we're setting that equal, we're setting those values into an array. And then in these next comment lines here is the example of the array that's created with that. So array value number 0, which is always the first value in an array, is now the last name, which came first, because it was Goshorn, comma, Darcy. And then the second value in the array, which is numbered 1, that becomes my first name, which is the part that follows the comma whenever I got the name from the LMS. The next actual line of code assigns the second value of the array to a new variable. So I'm saying, let's define a new variable. Let's call that variable first name. And let's assign the value that's in array slot number 1 to that variable called first name. And again, array slot number 1, whenever we did our split, became the first name, Darcy, which followed the comma. If I were to change this to array value number 0, my first name would be equal to Goshorn, because that's what's in slot number 0 in my array. But that doesn't make any sense because my variable is called first name. So I want to set it to value number 1. And then there's one more line of code, and that assigns the value of the first name variable to a storyline variable. Or I could more accurately say storyline reference, which is what Storyline calls variables. And the reason I have to do that is because all of the code up here where I'm working with my variables is actually happening in JavaScript. It's not happening in the storyline per se. It's sort of embedded within the storyline, but it's functioning independently. So since Storyline has its own set of variables called references, we have to make sure that things are in sync. We have to pass along those variable values into the Storyline references. So what this last line of code does is it says, okay, use a player function. These are a set of functions available to you when you're using Storyline. And I'm going to use the function called setVariable. And what that does is set a reference. That's the Storyline reference. And I'm saying, okay, set a Storyline reference with the quotation marks around it, first name. Okay, and the quotation marks kind of is my signpost that says whenever I see the quotation marks in my code like that, I must be working with a Storyline reference, not a JavaScript variable. So I want to set that value, that reference, equal to the value of the JavaScript variable. That's why they're identical. Okay, this one without quotes is the JavaScript variable that I defined up here. And this one within quotes is the name of the storyline reference. Okay, so you could technically have, two different names here. If you defined your JavaScript variable as first name 1, 2, 3, I could set my storyline reference name as just first name, but I could access the JavaScript variable called 1, 2, 3 since that matches what's up here in JavaScript. Okay, so keep in mind, I'm just keeping my names consistent to help me plan better and know where things are, where values are. And that's pretty much it as far as the script to get the student name out of the LMS. Okay, it's basically 5 lines of code. Okay, so that's all annotated in the document for you, and it appears here within the storyline files. Okay, so once you have your script in there, you've got your trigger ready to go. It's going to execute that JavaScript whenever the timeline starts on the first slide. So as soon as that first slide starts loading, it'll grab the name out of the LMS, set it as a JavaScript variable after splitting it, and then pass that into Storyline's references. Okay. Now we need to use that value, right? We need to insert the first name into the project, into the text inside the project. And you can see it here as this little special text here. So % first name %. Okay, that's how you insert a reference into the text like that. Now to insert that reference, you actually just go up to the Insert tab, and you'll see over here in the text section, you'll see a reference button so that you can actually access a library of references that you've created. So if I wanted to insert it again, like if I type hello and then I want to insert that name, I click the References button, and it gives me a list of all the references that I have defined in this project. And here's the reference that I'm going to be dumping that JavaScript value that uses the splitted name into. And it does show you, which is kind of nice, over here in the last column, it shows you how many times you've used it in your project. So if it's used somewhere else, you can tell over here. You can use this plus button down here to define that reference here if you haven't already done that. Okay, because you'll need a dumping place for your JavaScript to dump that JavaScript variable into. But once you have it listed here, you can just insert whatever value you want into your project, and it'll input the text there for you. Hello % text entry %. Okay, so that's how you would insert a reference, a storyline reference. And that's pretty much all you need to do as far as inserting the student's name in there. Let's go to the third slide, where again we have that reference to the first name within our text, but we also have this input box down here. And let's look again over here at our triggers column, or our triggers pane, and you can see that there are some triggers associated with that text entry. The first trigger, it says set text entry equal to the typed value when the control loses focus. So that's one that Ed put on there, that whenever the student clicks anywhere else, which they have to click that next or previous button in order to navigate, so that would cause that box to lose focus, it's going to set whatever they've typed in here equal to the reference called text entry, which again, if we look at our list of references, there's that text entry reference. So it's saying put whatever's in that text box into this reference in Storyline. And then there's a second trigger associated with this text box. Again, it's triggered whenever the control loses focus, so whenever the student clicks to go to the next slide or previous slide. And it's one of these execute JavaScript triggers. So we've added a new trigger. We've said execute JavaScript whenever the control loses focus, and it's that text entry box. And again, we click the little button to look at our script, and it's basically 3 lines of code. And again, I've annotated those 3 lines for you a little bit further down in the document with the agenda on it. You'll know it's the right code because it'll say begin script for input field trigger. So what you see there is just a marked up version of what's in that storyline file. So we're going to look at it with all my comments in the document there. So again, that first line is getting that player for reference, getting that storyline player. The second line of code stores the storyline variable as a JavaScript variable. So it passes it in the opposite direction than we did on the first slide. We're passing a storyline variable back to JavaScript variable. Okay, so to do that, we say, okay, define a new variable. Let's call it text entry this time. And let's make the value of that variable. And here's where we access the player. We are accessing a player function. That player function is called getVariable. That gets a storyline reference. And we're getting the value of the storyline reference that's called text entry. And again, remember those quotes are kind of signposts to me that, oh, I'm accessing a storyline reference there. It's not a JavaScript variable when it has quotes around it like that. So I'm taking the storyline reference, I'm getting it out of storyline using the player, and I'm setting it as a JavaScript variable called text entry. And then the third line of code is now where we're going to pass this variable into the user's internet browser local storage. So we're calling local storage in the browser, and we're using the function called setItem that sets a local storage item in the browser. And we're going to call that local storage item text entry. That's why it has quotes around it, because we're in a non-JavaScript system. We're in the local storage. So we're saying create a local storage thing, an item called text entry, and set the value of that item to be the same as the JavaScript variable text entry. So these two are the same, and we're setting that into the local storage item, also called text entry. Okay, and that's it. That's 3 lines of code, which just takes a reference out of storyline, puts it into JavaScript variable, and then puts that JavaScript variable into the browser's local storage. Now you can see this in action yourself, actually, using some advanced tools in your browser. So if we go back to the working project within the Showcase course, and I happen to be using Chrome, so I'm going to go to my Chrome Developer Tools, which is under the Chrome menu, More Tools, Developer Tools. And that opens this side pane with all the, the background stuff that's happening, where you can kind of debug things that's happening in your browser. And what I'm going to do, I need to go to the Resources tab at the top. And then in this pane on the left, you can see all the different kinds of resources that this particular web page is using. And most importantly, there's this local storage section. And that's what we're accessing whenever we've written our code in the storyline file, in the JavaScript. And you can see under local storage, there's the domain, mycourses.sbcollege.edu. And again, if you recall, all the pages on a particular domain can access the same local storage. And so when I go to that second page, or excuse me, the third page, where we have our text input field, you can actually see that it remembered our text entry value from the last time we input text into this project. That's the text that we typed there. So all of these lines here indicate different items that are stored in local storage. Some of these are from Desire2Learn. They set some things. Other things come from other parts of the system or other parts of the web app that you're using. So we can either rely upon that existing value, or if I type a different value in here, just the word blah, and then I advance to the next slide and lose focus on the text box, you can see it changed the value of that text entry to blah. Okay, so that's that function of setting grabbing the reference from Storyline, which is based upon whatever they typed into that text box, putting that into JavaScript variable, and then passing that JavaScript variable value into the browser's local storage. That all happened as soon as the user clicked that button and the text box lost focus. Okay, so we can do the same thing with text entry 3, which is that second item in local storage. We can set that, and as soon as we click outside of the text box, it's doing all those functions again and setting the local storage value. We're going to talk about some of the shortcomings of local storage because there are some failure points here. But I wanted to kind of save those for the end because they're definitely challenges, but we can overcome them by using other types of storage if we look a little bit further down the road. But basically, that's how local storage works and how you can kind of play around with it in your own browser, depending upon what browser you have. Okay, so that's the JavaScript. We just need 3 lines of code in order to grab the value that was typed into that text box, pass it into Storyline, then pass it into JavaScript, and then pass it into local storage inside the browser. Again, that's all done with triggers over here in the triggers pane. And that's pretty much it. If we go to the next slide, it's basically the same exact functions, just repeated with a different name for my references and variables, text entry 3. So that's how you would set up your Storyline file. And again, don't forget, whenever you publish, don't forget that you're going to need to publish as LMS, an LMS compliant file, because that's what's going to include that SCORM compliant format. So let's go back to our agenda here. And we've looked at how to configure the Storyline file, what kind of script you need to put in there to get things working correctly. The next thing is, how do you configure the Desire2Learn activity? So if we go flip back to Desire2Learn, there's nothing to configure in the Storyline anymore. We've done all that work in Storyline. Basically, you just publish it to the LMS now. But the question is, how do I then reuse some of that information from the Storyline file in that self-assessment at the end? Remember where the student sees what they typed into that Storyline project, reused again in the assessment, the self-assessment. So what we can do is we can look at, if I exit student view here, go back to an instructor view, what I can do is edit that self-assessment. You'll see what's happening in the background. To get to self-assessments, it's a little complicated. You have to go to Edit Course, and then you'll see self-assessments there. It's not included in the traditional nav menu. And so here's my self-assessment. I'm going to edit that self-assessment. And I need to add edit questions. Here's my list of questions. So let's take this first question, the difference between sociology and psychology. I'm going to edit that question. And I have the graphical user editor turned off. If you don't, just go into the code view using that button at the bottom with the brackets. So you can see my HTML code here. Let me zoom in a little bit. And I have a copy of this code back in our agenda document with my comments typed in it. So I just wanted to show you this is how it looks in my courses, which is where you need to put it inside the question. And then back here in the document, if you scroll down, again, it's that red commented text. You'll see it's the section that says HTML, CSS, JS for output to HTML and self-assessment. Look for that section. The first bit, this long bit at the top where it's a little bit of JavaScript, is basically to grab this font, Gloria Hallelujah, from the Google font library that's online. And what that does is it just makes, if we go down here to preview the question, that's the script that changes the font for that text that the student typed. Just makes it a fancy font that isn't normally included with browsers or with my courses. It uses Google's font library to make it fancy, but still accessible. So that's all that does. You get that from the Google Fonts website that gives you that. You just include it in your HTML. So I'm just loading that font at the top of my question. This second bit here, second bit of script, grabs the item from local storage within the user's browser and assigns it to a variable. So we're going in the opposite direction than what I just showed you. We're going from local storage back to JavaScript. So in JavaScript, I'm saying, let's define a variable. Let's call that variable text entry. Let's define the value for that variable. And I'm accessing local storage. I'm using the local storage function called getItem. And I'm getting the item that's called text entry. And again, there's those quotation marks. That means I'm working outside of JavaScript. I'm grabbing something from outside of JavaScript. I'm pulling it in from local storage to set it equal to a new variable called text entry. And then I'm also doing that with that second text box value, okay, because that was stored as text entry 3 in local storage. So I'm getting that from local storage, setting it equal to a JavaScript variable called text entry 3. The next thing, next bit of code there is just a paragraph. That's some narrative, which gives some context for the learner to say, well, at the beginning you told Rosalie that the difference was, and then the next bit of code is basically it's wrapped in a paragraph, and it's using some script to output these JavaScript variables, text entry and text entry 3, except just text entry in this case. We're writing that value into the document. That's what that document.write does. So we're saying take the HTML document, write a value out for the end user, and for that value, output whatever's in the variable text entry, which we got from local storage, which was originally put there by the storyline file. Okay, this little bit of styling up here is the part that that changes the font to that fancy font. Okay, because we loaded the font script up at the top, so now we can use it to style that. And then we just include a little bit more narrative. Now that you've completed the module, think about how your learning has changed, and write in the question answer, how your learning has changed. And that's pretty much it. That's all of the code that goes into that question inside of the self-assessment. Okay, so take a look at that inside the agenda document for some explanatory markup. And that's basically how you configure the Desire2Learn self-assessment activity question. And you can put that HTML for that question anywhere where Desire2Learn doesn't strip out scripts, because you need those JavaScripts, which is almost everywhere. I mean, you can put it in assessment questions, you can put it in web pages, obviously. You can put it in anywhere that doesn't strip out a script. And I know the places that strip out a script are definitely in the course content area, so in description fields would not be a good place to put that. And I guess the last part that we need to talk about is what are the failure points that you need to consider, or the possible bugs, because it's important to plan ahead for these things. Now, in my case, in this project, as you can tell, this activity is just to get students thinking about a particular topic. It's not to assess them in any way. They're not going to be held accountable for what they've typed into these text boxes. So I'm not too worried if they don't see the correct values there, if they see blank values, or if they have to go back and do it again, because frankly, it's just a kind of a motivational activity. It's not high stakes. But it's possible that it could fail, and you want to consider, like, does that have an adverse effect on learning in the course, or does it affect their assessment scores or anything. And the first thing you should consider as far as planning ahead for failures is trying to maintain tranquility in your variables. And that goes back to that table for planning your variables. You want to make sure that those variable names are very specific. And in the examples that I've been showing you in the project that Ed and I did, my variable names are fairly simplistic: first name, last name, text entry. It's possible that if somebody else had variables in another project that the student used with the same names, that those two values would then conflict, which would be a problem. So instead, I should have named my values or my variables something much more specific that it would be harder for another project to use. So that's one of the failure points that you can plan ahead and mostly overcome. Another thing is that you should have fallbacks available in case it's not working. So since local storage, which again, if we go back out to the project here and we turn on our Chrome developer tools just to kind of remind you what local storage is. Again, local storage is browser specific for the user. And so what that means is if the user started working on this intro activity in the library at some publicly shared library computer, they typed in a value here, it stored it in that library computer's local storage. If they went home and did the follow-up activity, which was a self-assessment, where it tried to grab that local storage value, there would be nothing to grab, since the user's local storage value was stored on that public computer back in a whole other location. So in that case, in the self-assessment, it would basically output just a blank line. There would be nothing for it to output. Which would mean that the student basically couldn't complete the self-assessment. I mean, they could, because they could just talk about how their learning changed, but it wouldn't be quite as magical for them, you know. They wouldn't be able to see the value that they typed into the introductory activity. So instead, what I could do, because since we know that local storage has failure points, since it's so specific, we could do an if-then-else statement within the self-assessment question. So if there's a value stored in local storage for text entry, then output that value. So show that value for the learner if they're still in that same machine. Otherwise, output some kind of default value. Okay, so maybe if they're on a different computer and that text entry local storage item is blank or doesn't exist, then show the student some default text of some kind. It could be, you know, a statement about doing it again. It could be a statement about, you know, cannot find the value, so just answer the question, something like that. And then, of course, that sort of brings to light that third point there in our last portion of this session, which was perhaps considering moving to the storage of data to some kind of database server that we have available. And I know we have certain projects that do work with databases, so we have to have something available. It's just that as designers and IDSs and IDTs, we just don't know what's available, and we've never done projects like this, so we'd have to do a little bit of investigation with server team or Jamie's team or whoever that might be. So maybe, you know, down the road we could look into those possibilities and see what's available to us, because basically we could use similar code to store these text entry JavaScript variables in another location. Instead of local storage inside of that's browser specific, we could perhaps store it on some kind of server somewhere. so that the values are unique and they're also shared across machines. So a student could access those values and a project could access those values regardless of what machine they're on. Okay, so that's a consideration moving forward that you could think about, and maybe you want to kind of jump in and take the lead on that and find out for us what we have available, either in my courses or in another server. Okay, so explore that agenda document. I've placed the link to it at the top of the document in case you forget. It's bit.ly/storyline-lms-pass to get back to it. And you might want to make a copy of it just in case, or download it if you want to take your own notes. But I've included, beyond the code that we looked at, I've included links to resources that I consulted to figure out all this stuff, to kind of teach myself. There's also a couple of other examples for you of people passing information from an LMS into Storyline and back. There's some game data examples from eLearning Brothers. I love them. They give you some Storyline examples. There's that list of API functions in Storyline. That's kind of a backwards engineered list. So it's kind of an unofficial list that I got off of a thread, and there's a link to the thread there. And then at the very bottom, just know that this isn't specific to Storyline. You can pass information in and out of other types of projects and your LMS. So if you're doing projects in Captivate, you can do the same kind of stuff in that software. So I guess the big lightning bolt for me as I was teaching myself this stuff and learning what's possible is that it's not just Storyline that we can use to pass information back and forth. It's really anything. It's that there's a standard. There are standards, I should say, for passing this stuff back and forth in and out of web applications and our My Courses environment. Okay, so thanks for watching, and hopefully you can jump in and try some of this out yourself, and maybe do a little bit more investigation into what data we can pass in and out, and how to pass that data in and out, and maybe work with somebody on one of the other teams to figure out how we can more securely do it and more reliably do it than using browser-specific functions. Okay, so thanks a lot for watching, and thanks for sharing too.